You're basically saying that surrendering to the IMF, as the government did, is just going to make things worse for the average poor citizen of the UK.
Yeah, good evening, Mark. Indeed, I only had a certain amount of characters I could talk about the IMF in that one tweet there. And if you look at what's gone on over the last couple of weeks, so the IMF kind of intervened and the markets have intervened, and even Laura Koonsberg on the BBC, when interviewing the Chancellor a couple of days ago, is actually asking who's controlling policy at the moment. Is it the financial markets or the government? It's quite clearly not the government who's in charge at the moment. And if we look at the IMF there, the cost of the top rate tax, that was the first thing that's kind of spooked the media, Mark, in terms of this U-turn on the budget, where we were going to cut the top rate of tax from 45 pence to 40 pence. Most of the nations across the world don't have a 45 pence rate anyway. And if you look at the cost of that, you're talking very small amounts of money. It was going to cost about £2.5 billion. Now, I didn't hear the IMF put any statement out when the UK promised to give more than £2.5 billion to Ukraine. Now, that is an unfunded kind of commitment from the government as well. So the IMF are intervening in these things. And going back to what my tweet was saying about inflation there, Mark, well, inflation, the UK figures out again today, it's just hit 10.1%, which is kind of hitting our historic high over recent years. And what's driving that is the energy crisis that we've seen across the world. Obviously, anything that's made with energy is impacted by that. So food's being impacted by that. And because of the USA themselves, Mark, has been putting up the interest rates, so the Fed, we're nearly a 1% difference between us and the Fed now with the interest rates. We basically got to track what the USA are doing, because if we don't, the dollar becomes more competitive. That makes imports like oil and energy more expensive. And ultimately, the consumers are going to pay. So interest rates are going up in part, Mark, because the USA and the Fed there. Blaming all this on the mini budget is absolute nonsense. And it's quite clear that the government, Liz Truss, are not in control here. This is the financial markets dictating things. And, those normal people who will go out and vote in the next election thinking they're voting for a manifesto, well, it's quite clear from what we've seen in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, when these governments come with manifestos, they are not the ones deciding what's going on.
Well, you make a fascinating point there, Jamie, because I think, when you look at what it would have cost to make that tax cut versus all the money that got blown through in the first year of COVID, there's no competition. But actually, you're comparing the mini budget with the other odd spending decision this year. So the IMF doesn't mind you blowing a ton of money you don't have if you give it to the Ukrainian people, but they won't let you introduce a mild tax cut for the British people. I mean, as you just said, what's the point of manifestos? What's the point of elections if the IMF just decides which bit of your spending it approves of and which it doesn't?
No, Mark, and the IMF themselves, part of it, like a UN convention, all the the people who work for the IMF in the US who are not US citizens, they pay no income tax at all. So, they're questioning whether or not we should cut the income tax of the UK citizens. They don't pay a single penny of this. And let's talk about, the migrants as well. Suella Braverman has resigned today, probably in terms of it, Mark, because she's looked at the facts and the figures and she's looked at the policies. And there's no support from the likes of Jeremy Hunt to actually tackle this migrant crisis. The latest data is probably pushing us towards £3.5 billion a year. Again, more than what the top rate of income tax would cost just to house them in hotels. So all these policies that they're not talking about are all adding up. The government said they were going to tackle these things. They clearly haven't got the control to do that. And we're in absolute carnage.
You're absolutely right, and they've got no plans. The IMF is all fine and dandy with putting up the 1,000 strapping young men a night in fancy country house hotels and giving them afternoon tea every day.